Hey everyone, welcome back to the Money Perspective. This is Eduardo,
And I'm Brandon.
and today we're going to discuss something that wasn't really talked about when I was growing up. Was the fact that you don't just need to be a lawyer or a doctor to make money. And anyone ever tell you that before, Brandon? Like in order to make money, you have to be either a doctor or you have to be a lawyer or something like that.
No, nobody told me that specifically, but I've heard. I think in the Asian community, for instance, it's kind of a stereotype that your parents expect you to be either a lawyer or doctor, or there's not really any other options.
Right. It's funny. There was that video of like the perfect Asian son, right? He's a sniper, he's a doctor, he's all sorts of things, and he's only like 40 or something.
Yeah.
Freaking crazy. I wanted to discuss this because I remember being told the only professions that make money in America are lawyers or doctors. And back then, I was little. I remember it kind of like okay, well, if those are the professions that make money, then let's go do that. Later, I obviously found out how difficult it is to do those things, and I'm sure they make a lot of money. I have a few friends who are actually doctors, and I I think I have a few lawyer friends. I don't remember. But dude, they're living a pretty good life, man. They got a house up in the hill. Their kid goes to some really nice schools. And yeah, of course, they make a lot of money. But
Well, where do you think that comes from in the Hispanic community or Asian community?
that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, because there is almost a stigma there. Like, you go to some get together and you don't say, "Oh yeah, I'm a lawyer." You know, it's like you're almost looked at as like, "Oh, okay, well, you're just a regular person. You're just regular dog." Like, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I mean, could it be could it be that one family thinks of themselves as in competition with another family? and and what happens is maybe the kids kind of get thrown into it. Is that
Yeah, I definitely think that happens a lot. And I think to that point, it has a lot to do with perception and prestige.
yeah,
Because those professions generally do make a lot of money, like you said, and they're also held in pretty high regard, and for good reason, right? The money adds to that regard. Making more money is seen as higher status, but then also, in terms of professions go, definitely doctors are seen as something that's it's like a noble profession. It's almost social proof that you're a smart, intelligent person, that you help other people, that you're contributing to everyone's well-being. Like there's a lot that goes into it, and I think when you get in those situations with family gatherings and stuff, it a lot of parents do want to be able to say that their children are doing those things.
right?
So it puts that social pressure on them to put pressure on their kids to become those things.
And when you show up to the barbecue on Sunday, and you're not one of these, your parents are almost like, well, don't tell them what you do for work. You might just be a martial arts instructor up in PV. You know,
Yeah. And I will say too that it's something that for the most part is, along with being high paying, it's pretty easy for anybody to grasp. If you say I'm a lawyer or I'm a doctor, there doesn't need to be a whole lot of thought that goes into like what does that mean? Like, well, you're a doctor. I don't understand what
yeah,
being a doctor is. But nowadays you can make plenty of money doing all kinds of other things.
right,
As an example, social media marketing,
yeah,
right? But to a group of adults that are maybe from another country that are older, the next question is like, well, what does that mean?
yeah.
They can't understand it sometimes. And so it's not really as acceptable of an answer, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think you get it right. You nipped it in the butt, as they say, because because yeah, you're right. If you have to explain to somebody what you do, your career is not as socially, the word isn't acceptable, but socially known or understood, right? So, what was the title you used? Social media
Marketing manager or something like that.
marketing manager, and
Yeah.
it's like now you have to do a 10-minute, like, I go on Facebook and I post ads, or I go on Instagram and stuff like that.
Yeah, or
And
people will just automatically in their minds be thinking like, does that make money? Like that doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard that makes a good living. A
right,
doctor, it's 99% of people would be like, oh, he's probably doing pretty well, or she's probably doing pretty well.
right,
So the
exactly.
thought process just needs to end there.
And then the next question is like, well, what kind of doctor are you? Or where do you work, or stuff like that, because they immediately understand.
Yeah.
Now, I did look up some salaries for like professions outside of the commonly accepted ones that make a lot of money. Dude, Indeed.com says a general contractor, like, median salary is about $110,000 per year. I can think of a lot of things I can do with $110,000 per year. You
Yeah.
know, that is almost literally twice my income, and I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
A plumber, Career Explorer, says that a plumber can make about $120,000 per year. My parents never said go be a plumber,
Yeah.
like, it was never, and I don't think that they meant to withhold that kind of information, that you could make a very comfortable living being a plumber, an electrician. Dude, welding makes awesome amounts of money.
And why do you think they didn't talk about those things? Is it because they didn't know?
Exactly, because I mean, imagine leaving everything that you know, right? Like, you you grow up in a small farm. My parents did, right? They grew up in a small farm in the southern part of Mexico, and they literally left when they were like 16, because they heard of a place called America, right? Where if you become a lawyer or you become a doctor, bro, you're set, you know? So I don't think that they meant to say there aren't any other professions. In I mean, I would like to say that I don't think that other Hispanic families, or Latin American families, necessarily, strive for withholding this kind of information from their kids, but they were sold on the idea that you go to a high school, then you go to college, then you become a lawyer, you become a doctor, you become something like this.
Yeah.
So they didn't pay attention to other things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could imagine situations where people are coming from other countries, and in those countries, being a plumber really doesn't pay you anything.
Yeah.
Being a doc, if you're, I'm thinking from my personal experiences with people that I know, for instance, there's a lot of references in my life with people coming from Vietnam, for instance.
Right.
There's a big community of Vietnamese people here in Southern California because they were escaping the war. And I don't know 100% for sure, but my guess is that back in the day, living in Vietnam, you probably, if you were a doctor in Vietnam, maybe you're doing okay.
Yeah.
You have some kind of cushy government job, maybe you're doing okay. But you're the guy that comes to fix some plumbing, probably not. Right? Now it's a completely different system of government, the economy is completely different there, but imagine you're that person that's at 16 years old, that's what you've seen in your world, and now you're coming to the US. Why would you ever assume that being a plumber is like, oh, that's a great profession?
Right.
You would just think, Well, doctor was a good profession back where I came from. Now I'm in a country that I think has more opportunity. And so, again, doctor, but with even better pay.
Yeah. You asked the question and I looked it up. In Mexico, in pesos, let me say that differently, in pesos, is 267,000 pesos.
Okay.
I don't know how much that is in dollars, but it sounds like a lot of money as well, you know? So let's take Mexico for example, right? Like, are we able to look up how much that is?
I want to say
Two
it's
hundred and
13,
sixty-seven
thirteen
thousand
thousand
pesos,
dollars. A little over $14,000.
$14,000 per year. Okay, all right.
But that doesn't tell, like, to us, that sounds like a very small amount. But that doesn't tell the story because, well, how much does it cost to live there?
Exactly. In $267,000 pesos, excuse me, I'm sure it can get you a lot of things in Mexico, you know? So it's not that they maybe didn't see that what I'm saying is that it's probably that they didn't know how much money that plumber was making. They just saw him come in and fix whatever, but they didn't understand that, you know, that plumber is you know, making bank. Now, when living in the United States, my parents have lived in apartments for a very long time, you know. So I was very little. I was, you know, 7, 8 years old maybe, and so they never had to pay a plumber. They never had to pay an electrician, you know, because they just call the property manager and say, "Hey, the sink isn't working." Oh, okay, let me send out a plumber, and the landlord has to pay the plumber, you know. So I think that unfortunately is a truth, you know,
Yeah.
is that there are a lot of people who have this belief that, you know, you have to be a lawyer, you have to be a doctor to make money, because they're not exposed to other things,
Yeah,
you know.
right. I think also when we're talking specifically about the example of a plumber, for instance, another thing is when people give, let's say parents give advice or anybody gives advice to somebody else, we often do it from our own perspective. We're giving advice because secretly in our own heads we're thinking like, what would I do? What
Right.
would I want to do? What do I think is a good idea? Not specifically tailored to that person all the time, which could be helpful advice, but it's from our, you know, what would we want in our own life?
Right.
And so when people talk about like being a plumber, for instance, even if it made a decent amount of money in salary, most people aren't really going to feel the urge to promote that to anybody because from their perspective, it's like, well, I don't want to work on toilets.
Right.
I don't want to work on sewer systems. And so, again, kind of going back to that prestige of being a doctor, like, yeah, I guess if you're a surgeon or something, you might have to do some dirty work, but overall, it's seen as like an intellectual thing, whereas like being a plumber is seen as kind of a dirty labor type of thing. And so people put that in the forefront of their mind before even how much they could possibly make in salary.
Yeah, exactly. And gosh, man, do I wish that these kind of topics did come up growing up? Man, I don't know, honestly, because I definitely don't regret any career choices I've ever made, you know. I think I think that I've always made the best decision for myself at the time that I made the decision. You see what I mean? Like, I worked for a bank, right? And when I decided to leave the bank, I did it because I thought that's what was best for me, you know? So choosing a career, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a lawyer and nowhere close to that. I am a martial arts instructor. I do work in PV, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. You know, do I make $120,000 per year like a plumber does? Of course not. No,
Yeah.
I do not. But actually, half of that. um, so it's not necessarily something that I wish I would have done differently, but I do think I would have liked to know about it. You know,
Yeah.
like I would have loved to sit with my dad and just hear like, oh, dude, there's people making a lot of money being an electrician. Being I keep focusing on plumbers, right? But maybe it's just something he didn't know. He just wasn't exposed to it. You know?
Yeah. Well, I recently had this conversation with my mom about this, where in general, again, speaking in broad terms, older generations are coming from a time where you did things simply because you needed to do things. The more you go back in history, the more this is true, right? Like, you go for far enough back, you did whatever job you got because you needed to survive. Like, you literally would die of starvation if you didn't just do whatever it took to put food on the table, right? And so that's been happening throughout history, and it's the last couple of generations they've still had that, but it hasn't been quite as dire. They've had some different options. So our parents' generation, for instance, is far enough along to be able to talk about, like, hey, maybe you should get an advanced education in college, because instead of just doing any job that you can possibly get with your physical labor or something like you had to do way back in the day,
Yeah.
now you can put your brain to work and work efficiently and make more money for less effort, or get a higher education and just be paid a cushier salary,
Yeah.
right? But even then, that conversation is still limited compared to the current generations, like millennials, Gen Z. We're no longer in a position, well, a lot of us are no longer in a position where we have to just choose a job or we won't survive, right? We've
Yeah.
got cell phones. This is a very wealthy country. We've got all of this opportunity. Now we have choice. We can choose what we want to do. And that includes being that social media manager. It includes being a doctor, a lawyer, a plumber, electrician. It includes being an entrepreneur, like all these different things. But, the reason why we hadn't learned that from our parents is because our parents were closer to those times where it's like you didn't have a choice. You just did whatever you needed to do to survive. And that came from a whole variety of reasons, right? It could be because if you came from Vietnam and you immigrated here to the US, it's like you don't have a lot of choice. You have no money in your pocket and you just escaped a civil war. Like,
Right.
do whatever you need to do to get on your feet. You don't have choice. You have very little choice. Or it could even be like, again, older generations are more likely to have kids in their 20s, like
Right.
early 20s. So they put that restriction on themselves, like, well, I don't have a choice. I got to take care of two kids, and I'm
Yeah.
already 23. So I just
Yeah.
need to do what I'm going to do.
As you say that, a thought pops into my head that my parents came from very little. I don't want to use the word nothing because they did have things, but they came from very little, you know? So I think, to go back to a question you asked me earlier, right? I think my parents didn't talk about it because they were the people striving for the top, you know? And once they arrived in the United States, they learned how difficult it is to get to the top, right?
You mean back when they were in Mexico, they were striving for the top? What is the top for them?
Well, it was that idea that was sold where you go to America, you become a lawyer, you become a doctor, and you're set.
Okay.
You know, so they were striving for that. They wanted that, but very quickly, life in the United States caught up, and they had to pay rent, and they had to buy food for us, and they had to buy clothes and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So they had to get a job. I remember both of my parents having jobs, and so uh, going bringing up the topic again that you brought up earlier is, well, that's something that they wanted. You know, they wanted the opportunities to strive for one of those kind of professions, and since they weren't able to do it, now let's pass that down to our kids.
Yeah,
You know,
makes sense.
so I think my parents wanted to strive for the top, and kind of wanted that for me as well.
Yeah.
You know, is go for the top and shoot for the stars.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable lesson for us going into the future. Like we can talk about older generations all day, right? But it's nothing more than mere complaining until we start to think about those things and think, okay, well, based on what we've learned, how do we apply that to our own lives going forward? And so for me, the lesson is where our parents' generation and generations before that, they kind of took what they thought they knew about the world and said, you should do this, you need to do this.
Yeah.
And they didn't really take into account fully all the ways in which their lives are so different than our lives.
Right.
Right? I mean, immigrating to another country is one thing. Like you're moving into a whole new system. But even then, coming from the US, like our parents' generation and generations before, they didn't even have the internet. So to them, of course they would say be a doctor or be a lawyer, because the idea of making money online just seems so ludicrous.
Yeah.
Right? Now you're in a generation where it's like people don't know any life without the internet.
Right.
So it's hard to relate those people to people that for most of their lives didn't have the internet.
Oh my God.
Now going forward,
Yeah.
for you and me as adults, when we have kids, if we're going to hopefully apply what we've learned from our parents and move forward, I think that what that looks like is us looking at our children and thinking, I can make suggestions to you, but I don't know if they're right, because the world has probably changed so much from when I was in my 20s and 30s
Yeah.
that your life in your 20s and 30s is going to be way different.
Yeah.
So instead of saying like, do this, be this, be this, it should be more about like, what do you think? Like, how do I help you think about your own life? How do I help you see opportunities? How do I help you make choices? It has nothing to do with like, be a doctor, be a lawyer for us and our children.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we help you examine, introspect, that type of stuff.
And you almost bring up a topic that I don't think about on a daily basis. I shouldn't say it that way, but I think about at times, because what I do for work, I have to get kids to sign up for karate, basically. You know, the student is the person who's going to do the class. So the student has to like the class. And sometimes the parents say, oh, he said he does not want to try karate right now. I'm like, he's 4 years old. No, what do you want him to do? You know? But you know, hearing this now, it's like, oh, it makes a little more sense, because as a parent, you were taught that, you know, karate, and we definitely teach these things, you know, we'll teach you how to be respectful, and you're gonna have discipline and confidence and all these big words. But you're right, the world is gonna change in 20 years.
Yeah.
You know? So how do we teach that kid to think for themselves? We let them start making these kind of decisions when they're 4 years old, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. Yeah, that I would agree with you. And people look down on that, right? Like I feel like there's conversations nowadays where it's like you're letting your kids choose what they want to eat for breakfast. You're letting them choose what sports they want to play. And some parents will be like, that's stupid. You know, that you don't want to let your kids have too much choice.
Right.
Right. And I think to what you just said, it's good to have that choice because they're exercising critical thinking, hopefully. At the same time, I don't think there's a full like dichotomy between you have choice and you can think about what you want to do versus like you just take a template and just run with the template. And I say that because if you're 4, maybe it is appropriate for the parent to just say like, no, you're going to take karate. I don't care if you don't necessarily want to do it, because I think it's going to help you.
Yeah.
Maybe this is not set in stone, but maybe it's appropriate to do that at a certain part of their life, and then it becomes less appropriate at a later part of their life.
Yeah.
So instead of taking this like it's all or nothing, it's appropriate or it's not appropriate, maybe it's where they are.
Yeah.
So to kind of like wrap up this video, I'd love to ask you again the direct question of, if there are ways to make money, to make a happy living, other than being a lawyer or a doctor, right? What do you think would have been more productive for your parents to tell you, or perhaps what you would tell your kids?
Yeah. Daniel, that is a really good question. I think that I would think this. um, I, w- I would have loved for my family, my parents, to have read more. The reason is because, as if they had read more, is they would have had more knowledge to give, right? So I think that I want to do that, and in learn and receive, knowledge, so I can be able to pass that forth. For example, knowing that a general contractor can make over 100 grand, and a plumber as well. Just reading that and having that information means that I can now pass it on. So I think what I would like differently growing up is for my parents to have given themselves the opportunities to also know that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, having an awareness of things
Right.
helps you communicate to your kids, you know.
For sure. What do you think?
I think kind of like what we were saying before, right? Like doctors and lawyers, it's a great profession. This is kind of a side topic that we should make another video about, but there's this idea that you could be pretty I think you could be almost anything that you want to be, even if it doesn't pay a lot of money. But if you're smart with your money, which means saving, not spending on things that you don't really need, and investing. If you're smart with your money, you can be pretty much anything that doesn't even pay a lot of money, and you could still end up with a lot of money.
Yeah.
Again, we'll make a separate video on this, but this came from a game that you and I played a long time ago called Cash Flow. The author of Rich Dad Poor Dad made this game, and one of the lessons that I took from it is like you could be the janitor and you could still win the game.
Right.
So that's a side topic. But with that being said, and with that in mind, I think I would, for my kids going forward, or maybe what I would have wanted my parents to do, is have that concept in mind and then help me think critically about, Brandon, like what do you like? Like what are you good at? What are you naturally gifted at that other people aren't?
Yeah.
And what do you like?
Yeah.
Let's start there with the idea that you could be anything that you want. It doesn't even have to make a lot of money, but let's start with those two things, because we want you to not only make a lot of money, which would come from the investing and saving, but we want you to be happy,
Yeah.
which means you don't end up in your 30s and you're like, dang, I've been doing this job for 10 years. I hate it now. I've always been putting off my passion that I really wanted to do.
Right.
I would want them to help me explore what I'm actually good at, what I actually care about, and then how can we fit that into, okay, we'll take whatever you earn from that and build from it.
Going back to the second part of your question is, what do you think you would tell your kids, kind of thing?
Yeah.
And like you said, I think this might be a good idea for a different video as well, right? But I've always thought about the mindsets between the owner of a company and an employee of a company. Both, in my mind, are equally important. Why? Take the karate dojo, for example. It is important to have a karate dojo and be the owner and own it and be able to provide the service for different families. But you can't be the person teaching every single class, every single day. You don't. There's no energy for that. So the equal importance for the employee is that you take that you teach maybe two of the classes in one day, three of the classes. So as a company, we can continue offering these services. However, I do I do think that there's a difference in mindset. However, though, right? Because I don't know if there's an actual title for it, right? But let's call it the employee mindset. I trade my time for $25 an hour. You know, I don't know that I want to teach my kids that as they're growing up. You know, for example, a doctor doesn't do that. You know, they get a salary. We're gonna pay you $300,000 a year. You come in, give us your services. You know, whether they're there Monday through Wednesday or Monday through Saturday. You know, I'm sure it differs, right? But there is a difference in mindset there. You know, I give you 8 hours, you give me $25 per hour. The owner doesn't think that way. They think if you give me 8 hours, I will give you $25 per hour. You know, the job, I'm charging $200 per hour. So I'm keeping $175 per hour. But I'm trading your time with my money. Here's $25 per hour.
Yeah.
I don't know how to put that in better words, but does that
Yeah, I mean, there's
make sense?
definitely different mindsets that people have when you're an owner of something versus an employee of something. And I think it's good to expose our kids to those different mindsets. One criticism of public education, for instance, is that you're kind of just being trained to be a cog in the wheel, to be an
Right.
employee. And I think that's a fair argument, and there's a lot there. Um, I think for me, going forward with my kids, and based on what I said before in terms of what I would want for myself and how I would want to use what I've learned from older generations to pass on to my kids, is have an awareness of looking specifically at the kid and not just applying a hatch of logic and saying this is what a good person should do, but it's like, no, what should you do specifically, you son or daughter, based on what I'm observing in your life? Let's figure this out together. Like what's right for you? And I say that because I think that as we kind of in society right now with the internet and all the different ways you can make money, there's kind of this glorification, if that's even a word, of being an entrepreneur, of running your own business and having that entrepreneur mindset. And to a degree, that's good. But there are a lot of people in this world where if you promoted that all the time, maybe you're not setting them up for success because not everybody's meant to be a business owner. Not every being a business owner comes with its own specific lifestyle and headache, right? And you start with this idea of I love jewelry or I love this thing, so let me be a business owner of that thing. And very quickly, you're no longer even dealing with the jewelry or you're dealing with the thing that you like.
Right.
Now you're dealing with HR, employees, accounting, finance. And maybe that person they're just not a numbers person.
Right.
They don't care about crunching numbers. They don't care about relating to employees, like
Yeah.
working with employees. Maybe they like just doing work by themselves that's creative and fulfilling with nobody else around.
Yeah.
So for my kids, it's like figure out what type of person they are and then figure out what would fit in well with who that is.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Well, to wrap up, you don't need to be a lawyer or doctor. Those professions definitely make money. but there's a lot of things out there that you can do to still make a very comfortable living and be doing pretty well.
Yep.
This has been the Money Perspective. I'm Eduardo,
And I'm Brandon.
and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.